lightly before we get started what we're doing, what we want to get to, and how important I think you guys are. And I mean this. So last week, I did that little paper that I read about why I think the book we're doing is relevant. How many of you remember that a little bit with your hands up a bit? Okay, so if you had time to think about it, like that pendulum idea, I think it does make sense. And so to that end, we'll see, but there's a book I'd highly recommend that's called, by a guy named Scruton or something, I think his last name's Scruton. And it's called Fools, Firebrands, and Frauds or something like that. And it's the New Left Thinkers. It's a phenomenal book about where we are today. And so just a little bit of reminder. So if I were to tell you what is sort of leftism today, and most of us have a hard time answering. Maybe you say it's woke, maybe it's this. But at some point, you're going to come to a Marxist picture. What is Marxism? And the reason I'm bringing this up briefly is it has nothing to do with the book we're in. Nothing at all. But it's absolutely everything to why we're doing it. And so I'm going to give you just another small, brief reiteration of why I think this is important, okay? There's a really important book that came out a while ago. It's called Reimagining Apologetics. I'm not advocating you necessarily get it. It's a little bit like egghead wonky, but it's good. But the whole point is often apologetics, especially the apologetics that we're going to do in this book, is very deconstructive, right? We're going to deconstruct false ideas, show flaws in logic. Okay, amen. But one of the most effective things we have to remind ourselves is creating what's called a social imagination, where, in other words, you can picture what it looks like to do things right. So the church is sort of an imaginary. It presents an imaginary to people that aren't saved because they say, oh, I see what a godly family looks like. I see what godly marriage looks like. I see what joy might look like, what love might look like. We can give a preview of an imaginary where you can like kind of picture yourself in a way. That's an important thing. So how do you do that in apologetics? And it's really challenging. So what I'm advocating for in the book we're in is this. When I mentioned leftism and fascism, Marxism, all the rest, there's a certain way of defining it. I used to call it revenge of the losers. I think it is actually a scholarly definition, believe it or not. I really do. It's the best definition of Marxism you can come out is revenge of the losers. However, I don't mean that in a like the jock sense, like losers, but actually kind of. Marxism is ultimately the most terrible thing it's done that I've been saying for literally a decade that we're now actually feeling in our everyday life, and particularly in our politics and propaganda. The thing of Marxism we have isn't just identity politics. It's not just it's not about Israel and Hamas and none of that. The issue is that for the Marxist, words don't have meaning and debate doesn't have meaning. And when I say that, you're like, what do you mean? Words are a guise for power in Marxism. In other words, if I make an argument that convinces you in normal life, then that person would say, I have to examine my presuppositions and change my view. The fact that we think that we think, hey, if I make a good argument and we disagree and we'll argue it out, that is a romantic assumption that we do not have at this moment as a culture. We can do that among one another in our like circles, but if you disagree with someone who vehemently disagrees with you and you make a solid point, it doesn't hit. And it's not because they're dumb, it's not because they hate you. I'll give you an example. Prior, like, I don't know, 3 to 5 years ago, Chuck Schumer, Democratic leader, makes the case that Trump was, because Maduro was in power, and so they make the sense, hey, you spoke really big on Maduro, but you didn't do anything about Maduro. It was just a way to attack Trump because Maduro's in power. And they said this at the time because Biden had put out a warrant to arrest Maduro for, I think, like $50 million. So the United States obviously went on to bat saying we should remove Maduro. Biden says we should. Chuck Schumer makes fun of Trump for talking tough on Maduro but doing nothing about it. Fast forward to just the other day, Trump takes out Maduro, 88 minutes long, takes him out as one of the most amazing military moments. It's awesome. This is a few months after taking out the Fordo nuclear facilities. I mean, foreign policy-wise, these are big wins, but that doesn't matter for my point. Chuck Schumer's the same man, just a couple years later, from the same perch, gets mad at Trump and says, I can't believe you took out Maduro. I can't believe you did. And if you go watch the two juxtaposed, you would think this is a sort of a damning picture of contradiction. And you'd be wrong. You'd be wrong. The ability for the left to change the thing they're fighting about on a dime, to go from I'm pro this to the next day I'm totally anti the opposite on a dime, like on one moment. You know, we keep thinking, oh, it's a trick or they're just mocking you. No. That's Marxist thinking. And the idea is that the argument doesn't matter. The label does. The whole speech itself is a guise for power. So if you use logic and it's proper, that is how someone can say, that math is white supremacy. You're like, what? You're like, it's just math is a guise for power. It keeps people, the whole world is viewed from the lens of power, and the people that have it, we basically say shouldn't, and the people that shouldn't can have it if they give me power. That's all of what Marxism is. And so we're used to that. That's how the media speaks right now. It doesn't speak in real talk. There's no communication. It's like, it feels helpless. So then why would I take us through this book? It's absolutely imperative you know this, because if I'm wrong, it's fine. But if I'm right, if you capture what I'm saying, I think it's beautiful. What I'm saying, this book is totally about rationality. And we're going to rip it to shreds at different aspects of like what's rational, presuppositions. We're going to do thinking. We're going to do debate. And it's against an opponent that doesn't essentially exist in public right now, which is like the new atheists, maybe online. The reason I think there's something special about what we're doing is, even if someone vehemently disagrees with what I'm saying, they should be comforted by the conversation. Because what's happening in this space should feel like a weird sense of oxygen. Like the most atheistic, God-hating person actually, I think, would love what we're doing right now and would really like even the disagreement, because it's oxygen. It's a world where ideas do matter and you can disagree. And even if we disagree vehemently, the culture, we don't have that anymore. Everyone's in the culture where words don't have meaning. It's just a guise for power, so there's no communication. So here we are. Let's talk about words. Let's debate and disagree. There's a romanticism here that we're doing. There's a social imaginary. Remember this. Now, here's why. I do believe the culture will turn back to this, and when it does, it will not give us a nice warm on-ramp into remembering what it's like to argue rationally. It will come at us with teeth. But if we're already there making the arguments, we're already ahead of it. So my plan is to do this, and in the next book, I might teach the Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, which is super gnarly, heavy-duty stuff. So that's my plan. If you're confused by any of this, just go back and listen again. Whatever. All right, let me pray. God, bless tonight in this book, chapter 1. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so let's go through it. Chapter 1 is a chock full of stuff. I'm going to go as far as I can. That leaves enough time for me to give you this last little paper at the end. And Brian, do you mind throwing the air conditioning? It feels like kind of warm in here. I think it's my fault. I didn't put on earlier. Forgive me. I'm up here on the lights. If you're cold, that's your problem. All right, War of the Worldviews. I'm going to read a lot and talk. So again, God's Undertaker, Lennox. Let's go through it. So here's a quote. Peter Atkins, big atheist. He says, science and religion cannot be reconciled. Sir Gillian France, he says, all my studies in science have confirmed my faith. Richard Dawkins says, next time that somebody tells you that something is true, why not say to them, what kind of evidence is there for that? And if they can't give you a good answer, I hope you'll think very carefully before you believe a word they said. Ironically, we're going to use Dawkins' own words against him, but before we do that, let's kind of go back to what the argument is. Again, we're taking a history lesson. We're going all the way back to 2007, okay? It's a widespread popular impression that each new scientific advance is another nail in God's coffin. It's an impression fueled by influential scientific thinkers. Oxford chemistry professor Peter Atkins writes, humanity should just accept that science has eliminated the justification for believing in cosmic purpose, and that any survival of purpose is inspired only by sentiment. So he's basically saying science has made that impossible to think there's any meaning in the universe. Now, how science, this is no longer a quote, Lennox goes on, now how science, which is traditionally thought not even to deal with questions of cosmic purpose, could actually do any such thing is not very clear, as we'll see later. So what we're used to saying is we're not usually dealing with Atkins, but you're dealing with someone, like if you have someone at work that says science is disproving God, like that's kind of the person we're talking about, like, how could science disprove God? It can't even disprove a thought. Like, it's not even the same genre. What kind of absurd statement is that? But what's very clear is that Atkins is reducing faith in God at a stroke, not simply to sentiment, but to sentiment that is inimical to science. It's totally at odds. Atkins doesn't stand alone. Not to be outdone, Richard Dawkins, the guy that wrote God Delusion in 2006, goes a step further. He regards faith in God as an actual evil to be eliminated. So you can see why I keep saying that I think culture is going to go back to this, because what happens with if Iran, the mullahs get replaced, which I hope they do, and it's really exciting that there's these giant protests that are happening in Iran, and that Iran used to be, if you look at pictures of Iran in the 70s, it looked like Hollywood. And then you look after that, and it's like everyone's covered in burqas and what. I mean, the people are resisting, and it's exciting. This is an exciting thing. Anybody that cares about freedom, anyone that was against The Handmaid's Tale should be pro-Iranian protests right now. Like, there's an irony beyond measure. But my point is, if it falls, I want you to understand what the larger narrative, because the narrative is never going to be, maybe Islam's bad. Maybe Islam's oppressive. No, religion is oppressive. And so guess who's waiting in the wings for someone to like pick them for the team again? These guys. They're waiting in the wings for the people to say, yeah, all religion's oppressive, including the Christianity that thinks that you should have value. So I just want you to get ready for that. Everything's set for this to be the next stop. So their argument is that religion's evil. And their case in point might be, yeah, look at Islam. We're like, well, I think Islam is evil as well. It's fashionable, Dawkins says, quote, it's fashionable to wax apocalyptic about the threat to humanity posed by the AIDS virus, mad cow disease, and many others. But I think that a case can be made that faith is one of the world's greatest evils, comparable to smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. I just want to make something really clear. These statements are embarrassing. And the fact we have them on record, I feel literally bad at first, because it's impossible to relate these statements to you without actually also mocking the man making them. And why do I say that? Not out of arrogance. It is so inconceivably unself-aware. Literally, the thing he's saying, faith is a belief, he says, is based on that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. He's provided no evidence for the things he said. None, zilch, nada. Zero evidence, literally none. In the very statement he's making is literally like the whole point, you have three fingers pointing back to you. Like he literally, it wouldn't pass first year philosophy. It would not pass a first year logic. Like when you have kids that are like 10 years old doing logic debates, when they start going through, like this wouldn't make it. But people took it seriously because we're impressed by his accent and it sounds kind of highfalutin and stuff. It is self-falsifying belief, right? Because he's saying you can't know these things without evidence. You're like, what evidence do you have for that? Right? It's like when someone says there's no such thing as absolute truth. Are you absolutely sure about that? Literally, remember that? We're going back to that. 2007. By the way, just FYI, skinny jeans are coming back. Did you know that? It's coming. Deep V's, they're coming back too. Just saying. Saw an article after I mentioned it to you on Tuesday night, maybe because my phone heard me. But just Google it. Skinny jeans are coming back. You're going to see it. Just saying, you got it here from me. I relate fashion to theology because it's true. They come back. All right. Most recently, faith, in Dawkins' opinion, has graduated, if that's the right term, from being a vice to being a delusion. In his book, The God Delusion, he quotes Robert Pirsig, author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which I read back when I was a non-believer, who said, when one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion. For Dawkins, God is not only a delusion, but a pernicious delusion. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that the illusion, I might not get through chapter 1 tonight, guys. I got to talk about it. The delusion they speak of assumes that they're free thinkers with all sorts of debate. Meanwhile, when you have groupthink, news speak from Orwell, that's happening sort of in the stuff, like, you start to realize, like, are you this like, it's just so amazing to have someone say, I'll give you another example of this in modern politics. There's just a big conversation from a bunch of lawmakers in Minnesota about how we need to get better vetting for ICE agents coming to Minnesota because we need to know who's coming into Minnesota, and it's not right that these guys can come in as ICE agents and we don't have enough background checks for them because just anyone could come into ICE and come into Minnesota. And you're like, if you were trying to troll someone like from The Onion or from like Babylon Bee, you would make this. This is a real headline. You could go Google it yourself, unironically stated. Again, guys for power, they don't care about logic, but it's insultingly unself-aware. Like you really are actually making the case when someone is against, say, illegal immigration, isn't that they're against immigration. They're saying you just can't have anyone willy-nilly come in without knowing them. And you're saying we got to protect these people that came without knowing them, so we need to know the people. Like the fact that it's said in the first place, you're like, whoa. So we say that, I bring this up to you again, all of these groups are so out of whack because I'm going to say this again, and we've lived, I'm only 46. I'll be 47 in a month, a few weeks. In just the time that I've been teaching at this church, I can adequately say these views were felled by the absolute necessity of the presuppositions of this book. And then the irrationality that we see also. Again, Dawkins today is constantly being quoted as saying we need Christianity back. This same guy, fast forward, a decade, we need Christianity back because, again, for the new atheists, they need to have Christianity in place so they can argue against it. And that's the absolute truth. So anyways, Dawkins is notice what he says. He says, such views obviously are the extreme part of of a spectrum, but they're the ones that people hear from at the time. Many atheists are far from happy with the sort of the militancy in these statements and the repressive and totalitarian overtones of such views. Fine, but those overtones are exactly what's coming. That's kind of my point. However, as always, in the extreme views get public attention. We have to address them. And so what he says, it's clear that the things that has generated his hostility to faith in God is the impression that he's sadly gained that whereas scientific belief is based on publicly checkable evidence, religious faith not only lacks evidence, its independence from evidence is its joy shouted from the rooftops. This is another quote. In other words, when he takes all religious faith to be blind faith. Well, if that's what it is, if religion is what he says it is, perhaps it does deserve to be classified with smallpox. In other words, if we come across and we talk about our faith, one of the things I say to people that aren't believers, and they tell me about their experience with church or Jesus, and they say, I don't believe in him. I'm like, well, tell me about the Jesus that you profess to have known. And they tell me, I'm like, yeah, I don't believe in that guy either. This Jesus, I don't understand. It sounds like you haven't met him yet. But the one you're describing, yeah, I don't believe in that guy either. Amen. You want to know about the real one? If they say, well, I know him. I knew that guy. I'm like, well, what happened to him? Did he stop existing? He goes, well, he never existed. I'm like, so you were faking it? So you never were a Christian then? Right. I'm like, so then you didn't lose your faith. You never had it. Just want to check. Okay, let's keep going. Taking Dawkins' own advice, we ask, where's the evidence that religious faith isn't based on evidence? This is a statement. It's just an assertion, literally an assertion with a lab coat. Now, admittedly, there unfortunately are people professing faith in God who do take an overtly anti-scientific and obscurantist viewpoint, right? You get the Mr. Steven Anderson saying that, like, the translators of the NIV, sitting down, you shouldn't trust them. Like, you got guys like that. They don't help your cause, Christians, when people do stuff like that. Their attitude brings faith in God into disrepute, and it's to be deplored. And then we get right now, I think the most common people now is you've got, kinists and sort of like, racists and people like that that are kind of migrated in the horseshoe right, that are saying things that are crazy. But Dawkins has had the misfortune to really meet a lot of unfortunate believers, it sounds like, right? But that doesn't alter the fact that mainstream Christianity will insist that faith and evidence are inseparable. Indeed, faith is a response to evidence, not a rejoicing in the absence of it. In other words, it is one of the things we want to do in our apologetics. You can't make someone believe. That's the Holy Spirit's job. Our job is to show someone why it's reasonable to believe and unreasonable not to. And people are welcome to not believe as long as they recognize they're doing something that's unreasonable. It is in other words, to not believe in God, at least as a presupposition at the very least, is an assertion that's unreasonable based on evidence that they actually live by. Period. That's all I'm saying. So, like, believing in God is perfectly reasonable. It makes sense. The Bible says it constantly. Heavens declare the glory of God. You have to learn atheism. It's an unreasonable assumption. That sounds bold. It is like what I want from you guys with this is boldness. Never be afraid of these atheists. When I first taught this, everyone heard me, and we still would get to work, and there'd be the confident guy with the God delusion here, and we'd like, I'm kind of scared. Now a decade later, that they are buffoons. So the ultimate argument now is so that you can be meek. Not that you come in like with a bludgeon as a jerk, but that you can recognize your arguments are real. They hold up to scrutiny. You don't deserve to be treated with such disdain. These arguments are silly. My whole point is that you can stand tall and calmly deconstruct the false ideas that come your way. We need to be ready for that. But in order to do that, we need to be willing to be comfortable handling the idea that the ideas we have are truth, that actually work in an objective world that actually exists. Anyways, Dawkins' definition of blind faith turns out, therefore, to be the exact opposite of the biblical picture of faith, right? Curious that he doesn't really seem to be aware of that discrepancy, and maybe it's a consequence of his own blind faith, right? His idiosyncratic definition of faith provides a striking example of the very kind of thinking he's claiming to be against, right? Which is thinking that's not evidence-based. He says a bunch of stuff that's against evidence. It would take literally 2 seconds to Google. Now, remember in 2006 when he wrote, the iPhone didn't exist, so he would have had to go to like a computer to Google this, but to Google what faith is from any Christian that's existed for any period of time, and there's no definition of faith typically that is blind faith. I mean, almost nobody holds to that. So to create a straw man and to deny it in the same book that you're talking about how evidence matters is a pretty sort of hard task. In an exhibition of breathtaking inconsistency, evidence is the very thing he fails to supply for his claim that independence of evidence is faith's joy. And the reason why he fails to supply such evidence isn't hard to find. There just isn't any. It doesn't take great research to ascertain that no serious biblical scholar or thinker would support Dawkins' definition of faith. None. Francis Collins says of Dawkins' definition that it, quote, certainly does not describe the faith of most serious believers in history, nor of most of those in my personal acquaintance or anybody you can ask at any church. Collins' point is important, for it shows that the new atheists, in rejecting all faith as blind faith, are seriously undermining their own credibility. Their argument isn't credible. As John Hout says, quote, even one white crow is enough to show that not all crows are black. So surely the existence of countless believers who reject the new atheist's simplistic definition of faith is enough to place in question the applicability of their critiques to a significant section of the religious population. Alistair McGrath points out in his recent highly accessible assessment of Dawkins' position that Dawkins has signally failed to engage with even one serious Christian thinker at all. What then should we think of his excellent maxim, quote, next time that somebody tells you that something's true, why not say to them what kind of evidence is there for that? And if they can't give you a good answer, I hope you'll think very carefully before you believe a word they said. The Bible says a fool is, they open their mouth and everyone knows they're a fool, and this is a book written by a fool, and I can say that with the most kind, technical definition possible. One might well be forgiven for giving him the powerful temptation to apply Dawkins' maxim to himself. I've done it repeatedly. But Dawkins isn't alone in holding the erroneous notion that faith in God isn't based on any kind of evidence. Experience shows that it's relatively common among members of the scientific community, even though it may well be formulated in somewhat different ways. And he goes on in the book. I'm not going to go through this chapter, but essentially, plenty of scientists will make the claim, the illusion that scientists are all atheists. And that's not true. There's plenty of scientists that are not atheists. And so the argument that somehow science leads to atheism is denied by the very fact that prominent, eminent scientists, some in this room right now, but like research scientists, let's say, prominent research scientists doing these things, there's plenty of them that are, straight up like card-carrying, Bible-believing Christians. We have many at this church, like excellent people of science, and we see these things, which totally, just same like the white crow argument, shows you can't say that somehow, this isn't sort of a statistics test. Like, this is an absurd argument. He goes through some surveys and how you go through it, but regardless what you get to it, the idea is that the question isn't settled by statistics. However, interesting they may be, certainly the confessed faith in God, even of eminent scientists, doesn't seem to have any modulating effect on the strident tones used by Atkins, Dawkins, and others as they orchestrate their war against God in the name of science. We hear this all the time. Again, this kind of argumentation is sophomoric. It's embarrassing. It's the argumentation you would hear about. We had 50, we hear this in the debates repeatedly after I've tried to use examples that we've seen the other side of them. And the reason I'm using big public political ones often is that we watch them live. And so in the debate where Biden gets up and said repeatedly that the Hunter Biden laptop, he had 51 intelligence agents saying that this was Russian propaganda. And if you're listening to the experts, you'd be like, well, that seems to be a consensus. He's trying to paint Trump into a corner and the administration in a corner, like that's absurd. But if you go back a step, you're like, we found out 100% that was untrue, that it was actually real. There is no debate from any person, period. But no one goes back and goes to those 51 people and said, you're an idiot, you're a liar, you're a political hack. We just let them tell us the next thing where we say prominent scientists, and that's kind of what we're getting to with Dawkins here and Atkins and the rest. They just keep repeating claims that just don't have any merit, and we just keep feeling like that's an argument. So they're basically, it'd be more accurate to say that they're convinced not so much that science is at war with God, but that the war is over and science has gained the final victory. That's their argument. The world simply has to be informed that, to echo Nietzsche, God is dead and science is buried. And so this isn't how we see these arguments. You might see it in a thread, a text thread, or not like one of those internet threads, where you see someone. I'm a lurker. I probably a decade ago decided to never comment actually ever on social media except to say happy birthday. People used to try to tag me in things, so I'd reply, and they just know I don't right now. I don't have time. Nobody's got time for that. I also just don't think it's my ministry to talk to people that are, wrong on the internet. But some people should, right? But it might look something like this. Someone posts something about, we found a full dinosaur with, skin on it. And someone says, wow, God's amazing. It's like, God is not real. Science has proven it. And they're like, oh, why do you think that? Just read any science book. Duh. And then the next thing is ad hominems and arguments about how you're dumb. At a little bit more sophisticated level with an accent, that's literally what these guys' whole argument is. Didn't you just read a science book? The whole thing is premised on making you feel like a rube. Like it's a narrative, it's propaganda. It's settling a narrative, calling you a name, trying to make you say "nuh-uh" and like live up to the narrative in some way. And so it's not very effective. But if you go on, the statistics aside, Atkins says this. He says, science and religion cannot be reconciled, and humanity should begin to appreciate the power of its child and to beat off all attempts at compromise. Religion has failed, and its failures should stand exposed. Science, with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence through the identification of the minimal, the supreme delight of the intellect, should be acknowledged king. The man, Peter Atkins, that wrote this, notice what he's doing right now. I'm having so much fun. Having done this and doing this now on the other side of knowing who won the game is really fun. What we're doing, the exercise we're doing for the next few months is two people talking smack about who's going to win the next UFC fight. But you're in a time machine and you know who won. So the guy that's super confident that Conor McGregor is going to really beat that guy up, you get to go back, you get to talk in real time and see. Like one of my favorite things after the last presidential election was to go back on all the news things that I saved prior to that and watch as the numbers came in real time and all the confident comments and watch people have to sputter as they're wrong because we rarely no one admits it ever. And so here you have this Atkins, what he's saying again is that he's trying to dunk on Christianity. He's trying to make Christians like literally apologize. That we need to recognize that science is the child that has been developed, and we have to take every attempt at compromising even slightly with any religious belief at all. And we have to say that religion has failed, and its failures have to stand exposed. And I'm like, here we are reading a book where this man's presuppositions have absolutely been exposed. His argument that unsort of fettered science was going to give us, what did he say? The delight of the intellect and that the identification of the successful pursuit of universal competence. He says this when we had the head of, the human health services was a not attractive man dressed up as a woman, as we were told repeatedly some of the most absurd things. And this is competence. We all know it's not competence. The emperor has no clothes. Atkins has been, let's say this way, his view has failed. The views he has absolutely failed. It's been exposed, truly exposed. Acknowledge this right now. There's a scene in the Bible where Joshua was taking the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, into the land. And this isn't a scene that you probably hear sermons on. And these kings oppose them. And God gives them a great victory. And so then Joshua takes the king before he executes them, and he puts his foot on their neck, and he has the Jewish people come by and do it again. Now, I'm not going to get into the commentary on this, but what he wanted these people that had been enslaved for so many years to see was, these people are not over you. On God's side, they're not over you. You're the conqueror. They're the conquered. Now, that's not comforting in our moment, but when it comes to the realm of ideology and ideas, this view, these folks, I want us to ideologically put our foot for a moment on the neck of these ideas for this night and say, these ideas have not helped. They have not given us a just society. They've created chaos and absolute politicization of every field of science. We now have a hard time trusting our FBI. We have a hard time trusting Health and Human Services. We have a hard time trusting the American Medical Association. We have a hard time trusting, like literally, you go back and you look at these institutions have been just gutted from the inside from people talking with snarky confidence. And we gave them the rope back in 2006 and said, you sound smart and you've got an accent, let's go with it. And here we are. It's a proper moment for you to acknowledge this because I don't want you to ever fear again. This triumphalist language that he used is apparent. But the question we have to ask is, has their triumph really been secured? This was written before, while these guys were at the peak of their power. Lennox writes, which religion has failed? At what level? Although science is certainly a delight, is it really the supreme delight of the intellect? Well, how do you say that when you have safe spaces for furries and in the elite institutions? Do music, art, literature, love, and truth have nothing to do with the intellect? I can hear the rising chorus of protest from the humanities. I just love the romantic idea that there's still an attempt at debate and there's still an attempt at decorum and stuff. He doesn't even, if you were making the argument now, you say, what do you say about the furry? It's so much, you just troll. There's no date. Everyone just scurried away. What's more, the fact that there are scientists who appear to be at war with God is not quite the same thing as science itself being at war with God. That's true for everything. Some musicians are militant atheists. Does that mean that music is at war with God? Hardly, right? The point here can be expressed as follows. Statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. Let me repeat that for the folks in the back, okay? Statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. Why is that helpful? There's a difference between me saying, thus saith the Lord, and reading the Bible, and me telling you my opinion of like what kind of leather bag you should get for your backpack. One is from the Lord, the other is from me, and probably the Lord because I'm pretty good at not knowing about which bag to get. But you get the idea. Like, statements by pastors are not always statements of the Bible. Like, statements by science are not necessarily statements of science, which is this is why the infuriating thing we lived through with Anthony Fauci was so challenging. You can like Fauci or not like Fauci, but what was undebatable, undeniable, so basic, at a basic level of logic, and it makes me feel like I was in Bizarro world, was he was constantly making unscientific statements and then saying, but that's science. And it just was so insulting. And the worst part is that so many people were just like, yeah, like, and it just, nor we might add, are such statements essentially true. Although the prestige of science is such that they're often taken to be so. For example, the assertions by Atkins and Dawkins, for which we began, fall into the category. They're not statements of science, but rather expressions of personal belief, indeed of faith, fundamentally no different than any expression of faith. The kinds of faith that Dawkins wants to eradicate. In other words, let me say it this way. Scientism, which we're going to kind of get to later, but is the basic idea that the only things you can know are things that are scientifically testable. But the very statement itself is a statement of philosophy because you can't test that statement. You can't test that. There's no way to measure that statement. There's no way to repeat that statement. There's no way to get statistics. It literally is an untestable assertion that there's no such thing as untestable assertions. That could be true. It doesn't work on its face. It's an unstable, it's like there's no such thing as A doesn't equal non-A. It denies the law of non-contradiction. It's absurd on its face, and it should never be taken seriously. And I think we take the reason living through this. How many of you remember 2006 and 7? Anyone remember this? How many remember 2006 and 7, right? No one remembers it. Put your hands up. Let me see. Do you remember how intimidating it seemed that these like smart British sounding voices are saying this? We all were like, it's kind of complicated. Like, it was, ugh. But they weren't making scientific statements. They were making philosophical statements constantly, bad ones at that don't hold up. And we were like nervous. And here's why we were nervous. We're not well taught. We're not robust thinkers. Not normally. Even at the high, like some of you have very, very high levels of education, and you can probably acknowledge there's specialists in those fields, but that doesn't mean they're good thinkers. This is an unfortunate problem in this nation. We just haven't, we don't develop critical thinking. And so we can be forgiven for the fact that we're not good at it. It's a muscle. And you probably will not even realize this, but as you go about your life, just spending time exposed to the discomfort of thinking through ideas kind of makes that muscle develop. And you kind of might notice that you're capable of thought. And it's kind of going to be intimidating at times to people. And that's not arrogance. Thinking is a good thing, but the fact that people get a showing and a thing just shows that we don't tend to want to think. And we need to remember that because we're coming back to a time where it's going to matter that we think, not just that the slogans and the propagandists. Our actually ability to reason will be called upon in the next few years. So we're kind of doing this class before it happens. Again, this idea that we go back to is that it's not science itself. It's not what it is, right? Let me go a couple. There's a few eminent scientists who do believe in God. He goes through some of the statements. These statements of these scientists that believe in God don't mean they're true either. It just goes back to the fact that here's people that are doing science that perfectly believe in God. It has nothing to do with their faith. In fact, their faith helps them to do science. It serves them to do science. There's one book about, it's called like 50 Scientists or something, and it's like 50 of the best, biggest breakthroughs. And it wasn't just that they're scientists who believe, it's that their belief particularly helped them to know the kinds of things to look for and study. It was a phenomenal book. I forget why 50 scientists believe in atheists or scientists believe in God. I don't know. It's probably from like 2002 or something. I have no idea. But Sir Gillian Prance explicitly says, for example, that it's science itself that confirms his faith. That's an interesting scenario. Because you have, on the one hand, the new atheist saying science somehow makes faith sort of not possible. And we've already shown it's not a feasible thing. But you have other scientists that are saying their faith, the science itself has made their faith like real. Thus, we have an interesting situation in which, on the one hand, naturalist thinkers tell us that science has eliminated God. On the other hand, theists telling us that science confirms their faith in God, and both positions are held by highly competent scientists. So what does it mean? Well, Lennox is very kind. He says it means that it's far too simplistic to assume that science and faith in God are inimical, and it suggests that it could be worth exploring what exactly the relationship between science and atheism and between science and theism are. In particular, which, if any of these two diametrically opposed worldviews of theism and atheism, do science support? And so then he goes through a lesson in the history of science. I don't want to get into this part of it, but the basic issue is that science that we speak of, we're often speaking of Western science. There's a key in this. The heart of all science, as we talk about this, lies the conviction, and when he says this is one of those areas I wish that Lennox were a tiny bit more philosophically inclined. I don't like the word conviction. I like the word presupposition. And use the word in yourself, like presupposition. What is a presupposition? It's to presuppose something. What does suppose something? I suppose this is true. To presuppose it is before you go to do something, I presuppose these things are true. In other words, a presupposition is you putting on the lens that you're now going to look at data from. This lens is not data. It is the way I look at data. And here's how you can tell if your lens works. How many of you ever had an eye exam in here? Anyone? All right, I've had a bunch now. And you know what they do? It's really fun. They show something and they said, can you see with this? Now, did the data change? No. The question is, can you see the data well with the lens? My friends, presuppositional apologetics is all we're asking is, does the lens you claim to hold actually allow you to see the things, the data, as they stand? And so what happens is everyone claims to have data, but their lens, the lens is not data. The lens is something that you literally assert. Everyone has it. There's things we have to just hold to be true in order then to look at data. So you're not proving the lens. You're like, okay, I'm gonna pick this lens. I think this one will work. And so they just do it. Now, there might be reasons for you to pick it, but you pick a lens, and then that lens is how I look. And so what we're trying to do is it's not that the data proves the lens, it's which one lets you see it. And there can be debates. So the question that we're going to get to at the end of tonight in like 10 minutes is how to do that in apologetics. So just very briefly, at the heart of science lies the presupposition that the universe is orderly, that it's designed. No, maybe I go too far. Without the deep conviction that science is orderly, science wouldn't be possible. Now, when I say orderly, what it means is that things have order that you can study. There's a structure to it. When I say the word design, that language implies a designer, so we don't like to say that. So we say, I don't like the word design. If I said at the heart of all science lies the conviction that the universe is designed, immediately you think, you're cheating, you're smuggling in intelligent design. Okay, but is it any difference to say orderly? For something to be in order, doesn't there need to be an orderer? Is it any different? Just because the word doesn't have the same connotation as design, by saying that the universe is orderly means that there's, what's the definition of order? You're gonna see the word design in it. You're gonna see that there's a functional, knowable design. There's a purpose, a telos, a purpose in the universe. Now, that we're gonna get to the evolutionists and whatever, not as the fact of what you can observe, but as a theory, as a presupposition. And the basic theory is this: time plus chance equals the illusion of design, versus the Christian view that things look designed because they are. And so here's our normal debate. Our normal debate is, oh, you believe in a young earth and you believe in old earth. Well, here's the evidence. And it's so hard because we keep slinging evidence at each other. I'm like, okay, you could do that, but I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in the person and their presuppositions. And so I would always say it something like this. So you're telling me, Dawkins as an example, is that the universe was made by undesigned, unintelligent, unpurposed accidents that just give us the illusion of design. Yes, great. Have you considered that it looks designed because it is? Because here's another thing atheists will say. They'll say, I don't have faith. Atheism is not a faith. Atheism is the denial of a faith. I'm just simply saying what I don't believe, not what I do. It's not my job to prove why I don't believe. It's your job to prove why I am. And we get confused. A reminder, Dawkins and the rest are not atheists. They're anti-theists. It's a very different thing. They're not saying I don't believe in something. They're actually stating a positive claim that needs to be backed up. And that positive claim is not that I don't know if there's a designer, but I think that's not their statement. Their statement is, there's no possibility it's designed. Their statement is, yeah, that's not true. It doesn't look designed because there's a designer. It's this other thing. I'm like, well, now you have to provide evidence. That's anti-theism. Do you understand? I'm jumping a little bit ahead. Do you understand? If what I said is hard to understand, do me a favor, just rewind this and watch that like 3 or 4 times. Like, let's slow my voice down. I don't want to repeat it. It's really clear, but these clear syllogisms take exercise. So which brings up the really issue at stake. It's the idea that's being put forward right now. It's a debate between essentially not science and religion, okay? If I already told you that the Bible, religion, faith, is a presupposition, science is a methodology. So the debate isn't between science and this presupposition of science. That's just it's a category mistake, right? We need to have two, like when you do a fraction, we got our math people here, we do a fraction, you got to make one fraction, match the other fraction so then you can is that a fair way to say it, right? You don't just leave two things like, how many apples does it take, how many apples is, Microsoft Office? You're like, what? Like, you need to convert things to like things so you can compare them. And so the argument that science, and then this is a presupposition for a lens. We're comparing a lens, not data. And so what the question is, what's the debate? The debate isn't data. It's not method. The debate is my lens, which is the presuppositions that come from this book, and the asserted presuppositions that Dawkins is making and Atkins is making, which is what? What is that presupposition called? There's a name for it. It's called naturalism. Write it down, naturalism or materialism. And to be proper, naturalism and materialism are not the same thing, but they're close enough that for our sake, just call them the same thing. If someone's watching me, they're technically different. Like, yeah, I get it. But just for the sake of us, just use them interchangeably for now. You'll be forgiven if you get one wrong. They're basically the same thing, okay? Naturalism and materialism is the same thing. And what that is saying that we live in a closed system. It's like, remember that book by Peter something? And it was called Oneism versus Twoism. Naturalism is essentially, you can see in a couple ways, but naturalism is the sense that the universe that exists, we talked about last week, is only made up of material things, the things that you can, empirically measure. You can see with your eyes, observe, with your eyes, you can smell with your nose, taste with your tongue, hear with your ear. The things that exist, material things. And those material things also would actually count as things like photons, and we get into kind of funny stuff with like quantum physics because we start talking about dark matter, but then they have to assume that dark matter exists because of this thing. I'm like, well, based on that, can't I also assume that I can know that there's a wind, not by seeing the wind, but by seeing what the leaf does? Well, wouldn't I also be able to say that heavens declare the glory of God? But anyways, the basic idea of naturalism, that all that exists is material things. And the problem with that claim is, we're going to see in a second, challenging because we can't live it out. Now, the other view, Lennox is going to call theism. I don't think that's the best view. I would just say that we live in an open system. In other words, we live in a world where immaterial things also exist. And we would say God. But I love the mind-brain analogy. But that brings me to kind of my summary, because I want to summarize his points. And I would again ask you to go back and read this. I just can't go too far in it. But his basic points are really helpful. He goes through Galileo and all the rest, and how really the issue was not about the church, but it was about Aristotle and a disagreement about that, and how really so much of this is more political stuff. But the actual conflict is between two presuppositions, naturalism and theism. Now, today, again, we're not playing this. We're not naturalists. Of course, everybody talks about their spirit. I'm a spirit reader, and they're on TV, and they're like, oh, that's totally cool that you talk to your spirit reader. But naturalism is not the same as materialism, but they're both basically the idea that there's no such thing as supernaturalism. It's not by evidence, it's an assertion. So how do I mean this? Here's how the game is loaded. If I gave you an autopsy, and you're going to go into my autopsy, and I'm going to say, hey, our job is to determine cause of death. There's a court case coming up. And so what are we trying to determine in cause of death? Well, first, a broad category, we're going to say natural or unnatural causes, right? What does that mean, natural versus unnatural? Natural simply means things went a certain way based on things your body naturally does without outside influence. It could be you got pneumonia. Well, is it reasonable you would get pneumonia at your age? Yes, right? That would be, we'd say natural causes. We died of, there was a natural cause. They died in their sleep because of X, Y, or Z. They had all these things. Those are natural causes of death. We know when we say, oh, how did grandma die? Oh, she died in her sleep. And we say, how old? Those are natural causes. What's interesting is when someone dies and they're younger, like say they're like 15, they die, and you don't usually say natural causes because we're not used to a 15-year-old just dying, right? So usually what happened? Well, they're murdered or this. So autopsy comes in and we say, well, an open and closed system. Here's how I want to illustrate it. We'll use this side of my podium as the closed system, okay? So over here, this is the presupposition of Dawkins and Atkins and naturalism. Come up with cause of death, okay? But no matter what that cause is, it has to be natural causes. We've basically said at the front end that there's only natural causes. I don't have evidence for that. I just said there are only natural causes. I literally asserted it. And now I bring in a body. And you have a body that's on a gurney, and you come in, and there's a body laying there with a giant knife sticking out of an eye. Natural or unnatural causes? Well, natural causes, it just looks like they were stabbed in the eye, but really they just must have had a lot of fish, and it gives the illusion because of all the iron that maybe there's a knife in it. I mean, given enough iron and enough fish, enough things, maybe it's possible for a knife to come, and that makes perfect sense, and it has to be this. The science proves it because we know that knives are made of, this knife was made of iron, let's say, and that's there, and they had iron in their blood, and it has to be iron. There's no other explanation that works, and if you say anything else, just appeal to things, you're a God of the gaps person. But that's a closed system. It's closed not because the science is closed, but because you closed it. You said there's only natural causes, and there's only things you can see. I can see a knife, I can see a body. I didn't see someone put the knife in him, but I see a knife there. It has to be natural. Maybe a knife grew out of him and he died. That's bad. Oh, anything can happen. It's the multiverse. Of all the possibilities of universes, there's one where this person is on here with a knife in their eye just because it appears. On this side, we have an open system. An open system is not, maybe it's fairies. That's not what an open system is. An open system is way more reasonable. Natural, unnatural causes. Well, you say, well, it's not natural for a knife to be in someone's eye. That usually is a designed implement of destruction, and it probably was put there by someone else or even themselves. It's usually, I don't know, maybe that's weird, but like it's not natural to have a knife in your eye. So it seems like someone other than the knife placed the knife in the eye, because there's not usually falling knives out of the sky typically. And even then, that would have been from someone because they don't typically like. So I would say unnatural causes, there was an agent or a reason or a person or something other that outside of the normal circumstances of life that now interacted with this body. Now, which is that blind faith? If you say yes, you're being absurd because we settle court cases. People go to prison forever. And you know what? We call it science. It's called forensic science. We do it all the time. The definition of naturalism is an absurdity. It is an offense. It should deeply, deeply offend you. It is disgusting, truly. And I say these things like those are harsh words. Naturalism has led to more death worldwide. You can look up the stats. It's led to eugenics. It's led to genocide. It's led to these ideas that have destroyed people. Theism, on the other hand, open theism, not open theism, I mean open systems, are just as scientific. And to deny the other one is just an ad hominem. So I wrote a paper. There's so much to go through in the book, and I'm like, I try not to do just reading Rainbow. If you ever want, I'll have a longer extended time where I just read the book out loud, but you could always get a book on tape, so why do I do that? Okay, so I'm trying to interact with the book. We're okay with that. So I wrote a book. I did, but a paper. Naturalism, Materialism, and the Denial of Life as We Live It, Taking the Roof Off. My Edwardsian title. So here it is. It's on, if you go to tonight's teaching on our app, the notes underneath it. I wrote this out. Feel free to use it. Here it is. Naturalism and materialism are not merely alternative explanations of the universe. They are total claims about reality. They insist that all exists is matter in motion, governed by impersonal forces, closed to purpose, meaning, or moral significance. There is no final why, only an endless chain of because. But here's the problem. We do not live as if this were true. Naturalism does not merely deny God, it denies the very conditions that make denial meaningful. My advice to you is to rewind that and listen to it a few times. Theism is more than God exists. Theism is not simply the claim that God exists, it's the claim that reality is personal, meaningful, and moral at its foundation. Now, this is an assertion. This is a lens, just like the other one is. Which lens better looks at the evidence and explains it? That's what I'm trying to tell you. My lens is that truth is real, that love is real, that right and wrong are not social inventions or biochemical preferences, but actual moral facts. And you say, I disagree. I'm like, so you do believe there is right and wrong? Sounds like you actually do agree with me, even in your disagreement. That's fascinating. But that persons matter because personhood is not an accident of atoms, but reflects something ultimate. In other words, theism explains why oughts exist at all. Oh, you're like, Matt, you're saying crazy things. This is very Schaefferian language. Oughts mean this. Every time I say there ought to be, when a scientist in the lab coat says, we ought to do this or we ought to do that, they're assuming that there are things that are good and moral and right that one should do. Every ought and should implies universals, right? And so my whole point is it's our lens, our worldviews that allows us to have oughts and shoulds. Theism is the only explanation, the best explanation, I would argue, for why they exist at all. Every time you say you should, you ought, this is wrong, that's unjust, or this matters, we're presupposing a universe in which meaning is not illusory and morality is not negotiable. Materialism has no place for this. So the person that says there's no such thing as absolute truth, all we have is science, you slap them in the face. Don't really do it. This is a different culture than when I said that last time. Last time I'd say that and people would know I don't mean to. Now people are like, I'm going to go slap people. Slap them in the face. They're like, oh, it's right. And I'm like, and their next comment, they're like, why'd you do that? I'm like, what? Do what? Why does that matter? Why do you slap him in the face? Like, why shouldn't I? Anyways, what do you want to have for lunch? Like, the reason that I shouldn't or should, the very discussion itself is only being able to be discussed in this realm. If we say we're in this realm, enjoy the slap, let's get lunch. Like, what do you want to say? Like, it's not consistent. The moment you don't like it, hey, now you can say I don't like the slap. I'm like, cool. Anyways, like that's the game, all right? So the collapse of oughts under materialism. Under strict materialism, there are only descriptions, never prescriptions. There's just data, just describing things. Neurons fire, chemicals react, organisms behave, but nothing ought to happen. Nothing should be preferred. Nothing is truly better or worse, only different. So the reason I feel so familiar with this is I used to have debates in coffee shops publicly with people, and we had a guy, an atheist guy, who was living on he had a breathing machine, and he said, he was a full-on atheist. And I'm like, well, what are you doing with you're doing some research here? He goes, yeah. And I said, but you don't believe there's a God? There's no morality, it's all just, he goes, yeah. I'm like, what are you working on? He's working on this thing to help like basically produce crops in certain climates, this like thing that you put on crops. I'm like, why would you do that? And he's like, well, it's gonna help for crops in different climates. I'm like, why would you do that? We want to help the people make better crops. I'm like, why? He goes, what do you mean? I'm like, well, there's a lot of suffering in this world, and if we assume that that's what you're trying to do, the easiest way to stop the suffering is to let the weak people die, right? Well, no. What do you mean? Aren't they taking your resources? Where's the value in them? They're just atoms and chemicals. Like what? Like, why are you allowing that? And finally he says, well, fine, you're right. We should let the weak people die. And then I looked at him and I said, well, your breathing machine doesn't seem to help your case. Well, I still think, and the debate was over. Not because when he said the next statement, he said, well, I can be very moral without God. And I said, I agree, sir, and I think what you're doing is kind. We had a relationship, we were friends. And he said, well, I can be moral. And I'm like, right, but you just can't tell me why. That's all. You just can't tell me why. You being moral is the same as me murdering someone in your worldview. There's just it's just literally just, why not? Under strict materialism, there's only descriptions, like I said. Nothing's truly better or worse. They're just different. Yet nobody, and that's what I mean, no one lives that way. This is what Schaeffer's point, so I keep bringing him up. He says no one lives that way. Everybody lives here. Everybody. And so what happens is they'll say, we should allow, X, Y, or Z. We should have the special limits. We need to have gay marriage because people are equal. We're like, well, why should we be equal? I thought we're a democracy. Didn't the majority not say it? We don't have it already. Well, people are equal. They should have equal rights. We're like, right. So you believe that there's people made in the image of God, so they're equal? Like, there's no God. There's only material things. There's no reasons we ought to do anything. Oh, wait, so then why should we have gay marriage over here? It's like, well, we should do it because people need to be treated. Everyone, love is love. I'm like, well, I thought love is just a chemical reaction. Like, I'm struggling right now. So love is a thing. It's real. It's actually a thing enough that we should change laws and actually, like, well, we have to care about people. I'm like, do you get what I'm trying to say? It's Christian. Our job isn't, like, our Christian is to say, when they try to come over here, you just go, poof, and they can't get over there. Like, no, sorry, you got to go back over here and make your argument from there. You don't get to live in this world and make the argument. That's the game we're trying to play. That's the argument that we're doing. That's what apologetics is. And you say to yourself, this is a little challenging, right? The materialist is protesting injustice. He's arguing for human dignity. She contemns cruelty, for example. They appeal to reason, fairness, and truth, but these appeals are borrowed capital. If thoughts are merely biochemical events, then reasoning is just chemistry rearranging itself. If beliefs are determined by survival advantage, then truth becomes irrelevant. Usefulness replaces correspondence. And if morality is the product of evolutionary conditioning, then outrage is just your preference with volume. Materialism cannot even say materialism ought to be believed. That's one of those mic drop moments if we were like philosophical, like poetry jam or something. The denial of debate itself. Here's the deeper irony. Naturalism denies the very possibility of rational debate. What do I mean? Debates assume that arguments can be evaluated, that minds can follow reasons, and that conclusions can be true or false rather than merely adaptive. But if every belief is the inevitable outcome of non-rational causes, then disagreement isn't an error, it's just a collision. In other words, if there's no like reasons and oughts and shoulds that you have that differ from yours, if you're just having random thoughts that randomly come up with things by, the illusion of design, but it's just random thoughts versus random thoughts, we're like, well, then why disagree? Like, who cares? Right? I mean, that just doesn't make sense. In that world, persuasion makes no sense. Responsibility evaporates. Conviction becomes instinct. In that world, you've created a realm where all of a sudden the Marxist idea that words don't even matter in the first place, they're just guises for power, starts to seem possible. It's the Dawkins and Atkins of the world that have led to the Marxism of the world that we're seeing yet again for the, half a dozenth time since the Reformation. It's this worldview that says that words don't matter, ideas don't actually matter, they don't actually exist. And the Marxist comes on and says, yeah, you're right, it's just power. And all those things are guises for power. It's fascinating. And yet, the naturalist argues nonetheless. Why? Because he can't help but live as though truth matters. Now, right now, we're not there, but they will again. Science itself cannot live on materialism alone. The presupposition doesn't work, right? Science itself presupposes things that materialism can't justify. For example, the reliability of reason. My favorite character in this is that he's actually a troll if you take him to his conclusion, but they don't have the courage to do it. But it was in the first Jurassic Park. Malcolm, that wore the glasses that are like mine, that shade in the sun, but they were always halfway shaded. Remember Malcolm? Is it Malcolm? Chaos theory, Malcolm in Jurassic Park. And they said, you have a coin, it's heads or tails. And he goes, which one is it? He goes, a 50-50 chance. He goes, yeah, but what if the coin never comes down? You assume that everything it comes down. Then he goes, nature finds a way. And here's the irony about this, what Malcolm does in the movie that I find fascinating. I wish that I could say that Michael Crichton was using him to troll the original argument between evolution and Darwin's origin of species back in the day. But when they started arguing for nature, they would say, well, we believe in nature and natural things and science, but they would start capitalizing nature. Nature with the capital N. They're smuggling in design and the very idea of calling nature and personifying it. And, well, that's not an argument about God versus atheism. It's the difference between God and an idol, a God called nature with a capital N. And so when Malcolm says, well, nature finds a way, the word find is an active verb that requires an intelligent person to do. But when you use that for nature, nature doesn't find anything. Stuff just happens. So to say nature finds a way is to appeal to a deified nature with a capital N. Do you get what I'm saying? It's cheating. This is my mind, I apologize. But the issue isn't really this. I mean, the uniformity of nature, the meaningfulness of truth, the moral obligation to tell the truth about results. These are all things that science has to tell you. Science works because the universe is intelligible, not because it's meaningless. It assumes order, not chaos. That laws are here, not accidents. Trust isn't an illusion. Materialism explains none of it. It just uses it to deny its own presuppositions. And so here's the inescapable conclusion. The issue is not that materialism is intellectually unpopular. It's that it's existentially unlivable. Those who hold it must constantly deny and practice in order to function as human beings. They have to live as though persons matter, that truth exists, that love is real, that justice is binding, while insisting that none of the things are ultimately true. Christian theism, our views, our presuppositions, doesn't merely answer the question, is there a God? It answers the question, why does anything matter at all? And the fact that we cannot stop living as though things matter is not a weakness of our view, it's actually a confirmation of it. We live in a world theism describes, not just us, but other people that don't agree with us. They live in the only world that theism describes, not the one that materialism does. And we always have. It's the only world that objectively exists. Apologetics, my friends, is not beginning by asking whether Christianity is true. It begins by asking whether you can actually live as though it isn't. We press a person's stated beliefs into the place where life is actually lived. where desire is strong, where secrecy is possible, and consequences are removed. And when we do that, the roof comes off. What I'm describing, my friends, is not as sophisticated as it sounds. We cannot allow atheists, people that don't accept these presuppositions, to borrow those presuppositions to make their case. Right? We can't let them do that. The goal in our case is not to force them to believe what we say, but to remove the excuses that make their unbelief feel plausible. And so here's a couple questions that I put that you could ask as an example of what I mean to take the roof off. If our love and these things are merely just, byproducts of the chemical reactions in our brain that make us feel like there's meaning, that when we think about marriage, when we think about love, it's really just, if fun is just dopamine, if we just make ourselves into machines and we say that, well, then what happens? So if you talk to a married scientist that's an atheist and say, if you could cheat on your spouse and no one would ever know, no exposure, no fallout, no internal guilt, would you? Make sure you ask it right in front of his spouse. What would you ask? What would they say? If they said, yes, I would, I don't think their marriage is, I think he's sleeping on the couch that night. Does your spouse know that your faithfulness only exists because you're restrained? If love is just chemistry and loyalty is just conditioning, what would make betrayal wrong in the first place? What if he says, I wouldn't do it? The next question isn't like, yes, you would. The question is, why wouldn't you do it? In fact, one of the biggest mistakes we have when we talk to atheists is that we always tell them that they're terrible. When we say that everyone's totally depraved, we're not saying that everyone's as wicked as they could be. We simply say they're unable to want God's glory. We're not saying they're all only wicked. My biggest question is, why are people so good? Why wouldn't you do that? I believe you, good sir, that you wouldn't cheat on your spouse if you wouldn't get caught. I believe you. Sounds like a great idea. The question is, why wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be a weakness? I just don't understand. Help me understand why you would just go with such a weird lie, right? And if he says, well, it would hurt her, I'm like, well, she wouldn't know. And further, aren't people just biological machines? And if he said, well, no, she wouldn't know. Okay, well, it violates my trust. Well, why does trust matter? Isn't it just a useful fiction, a tool to allow you to continue to be married? Well, he says, well, I might feel bad about it. I'm like, wouldn't that be a weakness? I just want to understand why you wouldn't. I'm left with just an arbitrary reason. Is that satisfying to you? Is that satisfying to your spouse? Would you want your spouse to know that your refusal to cheat depends on nothing objective, just your current wiring, has nothing to do with you as a person deciding things? Like, hope it doesn't happen. Maybe it will, whatever. Well, happy marriage. What becomes obvious, without any other word, is this. People live as though faithfulness has value even when unobserved. As though betrayal damages something real. As though love makes demands, not suggestions. And they restrain themselves, not because of fear, but because they believe some things ought not to be done, even when they could be. And here's the thing, the naturalism cannot account for that. They're not living like materialists. They're not doing that at all. They're living like moral creatures in a personal universe. Apologetics simply refuses to let them to pretend otherwise. My friends, we do not argue people into the kingdom. We remove the shelter that lets unbelief survive. And when the roof is gone, what remains is not an argument for God, but a life already lived as though he were there. Schaeffer said it this way: if we are faithful in our calling, the non-Christian should be left with no excuse. He should be intellectually and morally unable to remain where he is. If he does not accept Christ, however, he should be left more miserable for having met us, because he should be more aware that he's not living in the real world any longer. He went on further and says, we're not just playing a game, however. If a man goes away from a real confrontation with Christianity without believing, he should at least go away knowing that he has done so in the face of reality, in the face of someone who actually cares about him. The Christian isn't to make Christianity look reasonable by softening it, however, but to expose the false foundations of the unbeliever's presuppositions. Schaeffer wasn't advocating rudeness, intimidation, or emotional manipulation. What he meant was that unbelief should not be allowed to remain psychologically or intellectually comfortable. If someone walks away unchanged, still at ease inside a worldview that denies meaning, morality, and truth, then we failed to properly expose what they're saying. To use the logic plainly, if they reject Christ, they should at least know why they're rejecting him and feel the weight of what their rejection costs. Anything less isn't apologetics. It's us being polite at the expense of truth. Let me pray. Father, I said a lot of words. I pray you do something with them. Thank you for this night. In Jesus' name, amen. We'll see you next week.